This is CB Up for Discussion, a podcast series from Community Business where we tackle DE&I and wellbeing hot topics with special guests from across Asia.
Hello, I'm Chris, Program Manager for Wellbeing at Community Business, and I'll be your podcast host for today. Today we are delighted to be up for discussion with Grace Cheng, founder and CEO of AgeWhale. Inspired by her experience caring for her grandparents, Grace founded AgeWhale in July 2023 to help families navigate elder care. AgeWhale provides care concierge services that enable caregivers to better balance their family responsibilities and career advancements. Grace's expertise in caregiving has been recognized through the invitations to speak at TEDx Tin Hau Women 2023, as well as being an advisor in Resolve's fellowship program and participation in the Professional Fellows Program 2024, sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. Grace, thank you for joining us on Up for Discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Great. Cool. So, Grace, I was wondering if you could introduce yourself a little bit. Would love to know a little bit more about your background, but I guess really, what's the motivation behind AgeWhale?
For sure. So, hi everyone. So I'm Grace, the founder of AgeWhale. So we are a social enterprise that's dedicated to support family caregivers of older people. So we help family caregivers to navigate and manage elder care. But before founding AgeWhale, my background has always been in the social business sector. I worked in the Fair Employment Agency for 8 years to support migrant domestic workers to find jobs ethically, fairly, without any agency fees. And in that experience, I got to work with a lot of families and a lot of migrant domestic workers who are often hired to take care of children, take care of elderly, and I got to witness how complicated it is, right? Like in a caregiving relationship, even when it's supposedly an employment, is paid. And when it comes to caregiving personally, she kindly introduced me. It's all really inspired by my personal experience caring for my grandparents. My grandparents were the ones who raised me, and I was very, very close with them. So unfortunately, when my grandparents, their health started to decline, it's just very natural for me to step in to become one of their caregivers. By the time I was very young, too young, 26 years old, and I was completely unprepared for the role. I don't think I was ever taught, in school. We don't really talk about it anytime. So you were just kind of thrown into this role all of a sudden when there's a health crisis. There were a lot of things that I wish I could have done differently. And that really what the story behind AgeWhale. My grandparents, they have passed away already, but I still have my parents and they're aging. I am also aging every day. So I still see, this is still a very relevant topic to me, and I believe to a lot of us as well. Caregiving is something pretty universal, right? We were born to be a care recipient when we're a baby, and you never know when you would need a caregiver again or become a caregiver. So this is really my hope that through AgeWhale we can continue to support family caregivers to make this whole journey less lonely, less stressful, and more a positive experience.
No, that's really great to hear, and I think a lot of people will probably resonate the position that you found yourself in and kind of trying to navigate, their own journeys, trying to learn a whole bunch of different roles essentially that they're going to take up. So, given your lived experience and very clear motivation to sort of starting AgeWhale, how would you kind of describe the current level of support offered to caregivers, specifically actually in the workplace?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think caregiver support in the workplace is still not very common. I think there is more support maybe for parental care, because at least in Hong Kong, we have some legal requirement, right? You need to give maternity leave, you need to give paternity leave. But when it's come to elder care in particular, it's really behind in, our legal aspect, but also, on a practical level. I believe a lot of us, particularly maybe, I'm born and raised in Hong Kong. I'm Chinese. In Asian culture, right? Like it's kind of expected of us, like to just take care of your parents, of your grandparents. It's often seen as a private family matter. So not a lot of us would publicly talk about it in the workplace, where we think, oh, it's a more professional setting, we shouldn't bring it up. It's just our own responsibility. And for the management, for the leadership, because there's no conversation, so they also don't necessarily see that there's actually this huge magnitude of caregiving needs among the employees. So I believe I saw a study from the Education University last year. So they interview a lot of companies and working caregivers, and the result turns out almost 90% of the caregivers, they don't even know what are the kind of supportive measures are available in the workplace. They don't even know if it's available at all or where to find them. So I think there's a huge gap in information and in the kind of support measures in the workplace, and we still have a long way to go. Yeah,
it's really interesting you bring up. You mentioned different caregiver roles as well, because you mentioned more commonly supported is the parental roles, but caregiver roles, as you mentioned, can branch out into many different roles depending on your family circumstances, or you might be supporting friends as well. And then that gap between what people are experiencing in their own lives, that comes into work, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course.
So if that's not being addressed or supported at work, it's going to actually affect both the individual and the place of work themselves. So, and I think if we look at Asia, as you mentioned, and we talked about, you mentioned around an aging population, we're going to see an increase in people taking up caregiver roles. It might not be a concern for now. It probably is a concern for now. But we will most likely therefore see an increase in that demand for support. Now, what do you feel, seeing that we are in the position that we are, what do you feel are the immediate steps to take? And I guess an additional question to that is, what longer term goals do we actually need to set now, seeing of where we are in the workplace as a society, globally as well? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, you're totally right. I'm actually quite surprised that I thought we still would have a few years, to handle this, situation. But I was looking up, the statistics from the Hong Kong government, the population census. Turns out the older age dependency ratio, among working population, already exceeded the children dependency ratio 3 years ago. So more of the working among the working population, more of us are taking care of more older people than children. And in the same study, in the Education University, they also interview, about caregivers, who they are caring for. And among that, 40% of them, they're caring for their spouses, for, their parents, another, 40% caring for, the grandparents or older family members, and only around 30% are caring for children. So I was also quite shocked, when I see the data, because you would think, when we talk about caregiver support, definitely parents, would be the majority. But turns out, from all this, bits and pieces of data, we can tell that, there's actually a silent majority of caregivers out there. So I think, first of all, the immediate first step is really to acknowledge and address that this is, something that has been overlooked for too long, and we really have to bring more awareness, shed more light on, how these family caregivers of older people, what their struggles are, what their needs are. Because I think when I talk to, some company HR department or DEI lead, even they are not too sure, how many caregivers are there in the company. So without that kind of insight and information, how they, realistically could better support the caregivers. So I think that having more data and research would definitely be the first step. But in the long run, I also see how, for the workplace culture, right, for caregivers to feel comfortable sharing about what they're struggling with, I think that requires a very strong culture that they can feel that being a caregiver is accepted, is respected, it's not something that they need to fear, that would get them penalized if they talk about it. And of course, finally, on a policy level, how we could have more structure to the support measures. Like, I think, again, referring to the same education university study. So it interviewed employers as well. So they asked, what family-friendly measures you're currently providing for your employees. And the most common measures are compassionate leave, marriage leave, and 5-day work week. So those are the three measures that are most popular right now. But as you can imagine, like they may not necessarily tailor to elder care, or those may not be used that often. I hope you don't get married too many times. So I think having more formalized caregiver support included in the employee benefit system, and having more communication with the employees, right? What's available. I know a lot of companies, they also offer employee assistance program, but at the same time, we also know that oftentimes they're very underutilized. So how we can really encourage, the employees to make use of the support and actually benefit like from the company support. Yeah.
I think just reflecting on that, almost like a stepped approach to it. Number one is acknowledging it. And I think it was, I'll share with you some of the readings that I did. And I was quite, the person who was supporting me with this research as well, we were quite surprised in terms of what we brought out. The United Nations defines an aging population if the share of its population age 65 and above crosses 7%. And then it's considered aged if it's 14%, and then it's super aged if it's 21%. A lot of areas, certainly across Asia, are already in the super aged definition. So the fact that we still need to have that step to acknowledge, it's almost as if we're probably a little bit behind, aren't we? And then I really understand that the measures in place. We've got to be selective of what measures we take into place, because the measures that we use, whether it's compassionate leave or whether it's other different types of leave, does that reflect on other caregiver roles? And I think that's a really important point to raise within that. And then, as always, leveraging what people already have in place, the support mechanisms in place, but also looking into other support services. And so I think that's a really quite clear sort of stepped approach. So if we reflect on corporations, companies, workplaces, whether it's Asia, maybe it's globally, or maybe we'll take it bigger, if there are any regions across the world, who's doing it well? Who's currently who's setting a good example at the moment?
Yeah, I think globally there are, of course, every countries, we have different healthcare system, different elder care system. Demographics are different, so it's hard to really compare apple to apple. But at the same time, we also see, some best practices or some promising practices, abroad, like in the US, in the UK, like in Australia. I think there have been more and more focused elder care tailored support. So I think one thing that I personally struggle, like when I became a caregiver, is how complicated the whole system is, right? Not only the public service, but among, all the different private service providers out there, like who should I choose? What's right for my family? Can I afford them? And making all those liaison and all the coordination is very, very time consuming on top of a full-time job and caring for my grandparents. So I've seen, more of those examples overseas that, those companies would become like your navigator, right? Like they help you to analyze what's available to you, to your family in particular, and then help you to make all those arrangements. So I think that's really helped lifting a lot of burden off the caregiver. But I also see that within, companies, there's still a lot of things I believe they could do. I know quite a lot of big corporations, they have their own employee resource group. So how, people can leverage that, maybe make it an information hub, so they could share all the different tips and experiences when it comes to elder care. And I think the other thing when we talk about culture, right? So I believe for a lot of managers or leaders, they also need support, when it comes to supporting their employees with caregiving responsibility. I think currently there may be some resources for them when it comes to parents, but when it comes to elder care, is a whole other kind of area. So I totally see how they also need the support to, really make the workplace a more caregiver-friendly environment. And I think lastly, there's also been, I think the other group of caregiver that maybe is also even more neglected are those who have left the workplace, maybe temporarily to care for their loved ones. But after the caregiving journey ended, when they try to re-enter the workforce, so what would be some kind of reintegration support and process that could help them to make the transition easier? I think we have similar things for mothers or fathers when they go back into the workplace, but I don't think this existent in Hong Kong yet. I think I've heard something similar in Singapore, but yeah, I think it's still a very new area for us to continue to explore and then see what would make sense for us to adapt to Hong Kong.
I think to where you've identified some of the best practices is actually reflecting on where does support fit almost in this different stages of the employee life cycle, if you really think about it that way. And then you reflect upon the support that, like I said, is already existing, but for other caregiver roles. I think it's important, and the point that we're really trying to hone in on is this aging population. And as much as we're focusing on more common caregiver roles like parental caregiving, caregivers for the elderly is absolutely, should be a focus point, because we're already in the super age category in many places. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because we spoke a lot around the workplace support. And I actually want to specifically highlight the support for managers as well. That's a really key one, because we're very focused on providing that support, but very similarly, who's supporting the supporters, who's caring for the caregivers, in that sense with the managers. So the question I wanted to put to you is, with your own experiences and your own journey of trying to navigate, looking after the elderly, what would your sort of message, almost of hope, I guess, if you like, for people who are in the similar positions? What advice would you give to them who are trying to navigate that themselves and find that journey?
Yeah, I remember, when I was caring for my grandparents, I was working at a fair employment agency, and I'm super grateful, to have very, very supportive managers and bosses, board members. They know that, sometimes I do need to take time off to go to the hospital to make sure I get in before, the end of the visiting hours of the public hospital. So they allow me that flexibility. And I think the key is also how they've been very, very empathetic, to my situation. They never make me feel oh, you need to work those hours back, or of course I did. But then they show me that, they understand that at that point of time, that is really my priority. And their support really enabled me to continue staying in that job and caring for my grandparents. Of course, at the time we were a very small startup, so we may not have a lot of the resources to have employee assistance program and all sorts of benefit. But I think being kind and empathetic, they don't cost anything. And I encourage, managers to, have that approach. But of course, I understand for not every one of us may have the luck to become a caregiver, so we may not necessarily know or understand what's going through in your employees' journey. But so I think having more knowledge and having more understanding about this whole caregiving experience, that could also be a start. For those who have been so lucky that they never have to be a caregiver. So I've been very lucky to have been invited to some companies to do talks and to educate people about what is actually caregiving. Are you a caregiver? Because I think some of us may just feel I'm just being a good daughter, I'm just being a granddaughter. So they don't necessarily know that they actually qualify to seek help. So I think, and as a manager, if they also are not aware of what's available in the company, then it would make it quite hard for them to tell their direct report. So I think that's the other side, is the more education and information that they can equip themselves with.
I really love and appreciate that kindness and empathy don't cost anything. And I think that goes out to those that support caregivers as well as caregivers for themselves, having almost that self-kindness and self-empathy as well. I think it's because it's all about giving and giving and giving, isn't it? There's got to be an element of bringing it back to you. So I think that's a great message to all, really. And so that actually wraps up the questions that we have. There is one that we do like to sort of finish off, and we like to ask all of our guests is, what do you think the biggest way we can make a ripple of change throughout society is?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I did put some time into thinking about it, because I think when it comes to any kind of change, right, like it's always uncomfortable, like, because change in nature is uncomfortable, and sometimes it's easier to embrace the status quo, like, oh, like we already have parental support, like why do we need to think about elder care support? But I think having that courage to take a chance, like on people, on new ideas, I think that's something I think would really contribute, like to more change in society. As you mentioned, like AgeWhale's only been around for a year. We're still very, very new, but I've been very, very fortunate to have a lot of people taking a chance on me, volunteers supporting me. I got to speak at TEDx Teen Women, right? I got to be on your podcast. So I think those are all very, very helpful, and to continue to encourage change makers to continue on this path, right? To continue to scale our impact, to continue to grow. So I think that would be something I hope more of us could have that, take that leap of faith.
Absolutely. No. And that I think that's a great wrap up message for the whole podcast. So that covers it up. Thank you so much. Thank you for appearing on today's episode. And a big thank you again, Grace, for joining us on Up for Discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to CB Up for Discussion. For more information about our work across Asia, head to the Community Business website.